Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. My name is Reed. Running solo this week. Mike is a bit busy, so next couple of videos he'll be out for, and then he'll be back next week. Wanted to dive into a topic today that I have kind of avoided for a couple of years, largely because it's been covered to death. But I think this week in Batman #3 kind of came to a head where it's sad what's happened to certain characters. And so the character I reference in this obviously isn't Batman, but Tim Drake, Robin, who appears in the comic book very briefly. In the last issue, he was injured, and then they have in this issue that Bruce goes to visit him in the hospital. Just the whole interaction in the comic book is very weird. But the main thing that was just really weird was with just the way Tim is portrayed in the comic book, and that the way they draw Tim is, I mean, they make him look like he's 13, 14 years old. And it just largely kind of goes in with what they've done with Tim Drake in the past, I would say 10 to 15 years of DC Comics, where they really destroyed the character. And, this has been covered a lot because of a singular decision that was made. And I'll kind of cover that as far as the changes that were made to him a couple years ago, regarding his romantic life in the comic books and things like that. But it predates that by a long time. And that was really, I think, just a flashpoint of how lost they were with the character. But they've destroyed him, and I think it's just so fascinating when they take a character that was that successful, and he really is a symbol of everything wrong with modern writing and comic books. So I kind of just want to walk through where I think this went wrong and where I think this is a character that hopefully Marvel and DC could learn from. I don't think they will, but one I think that it's just sad to see. So the interesting thing is, a couple weeks ago, one of the great things about being a comic book fan in 2025 is just the availability of collected editions. In that, I think a lot of us have comics we read in the 90s, runs that we picked up issues, but maybe it was hard to find all of them. And, as a kid who grew up in the 90s, comic book shops and internet and stuff like that, it was available, but not as useful. And so it was hard to track down runs. And so there were characters where you probably would pick up a good portion of the issues, but putting a whole run together was difficult. So one of the cool things with 2025 is the availability of omnibuses and things like this, a compendium. And so this is a cool compendium that's come out about Tim Drake, Robin. It's got, about 50 or so issues. And, I read through this in a couple of days. And the interesting part of it is, I probably have read about half of it in single issue format that I remembered. And then the rest were all issues that were just really hard to collect and find and put together. And it reminded me how great the character used to be, how cool Tim Drake used to be as a character. The first Robin to ever have an ongoing solo comic book. I mean, and you look at how long that lasted. I think it's over a decade. I think almost 16 years he had that comic book. And how well defined the character was and how much he was his own character. I think one of the cool things about Tim Drake when he debuted is that, when they created him, he really stood apart from the rest of the Robins in that he was a self-made hero in terms of, unlike Dick Grayson and unlike Bruce Wayne, who were, you know, motivated by tragedy that happened to them, right? Bruce is motivated by the death of his parents. Dick Grayson was motivated by what happened to his parents and largely the training that he receives from Bruce. Tim Drake was largely just kind of like a child prodigy who was smart enough to figure out who Batman was, and then decided to become Robin on his own. There wasn't an inciting incident that made him become Robin, other than he felt like Batman needed a Robin and he wanted to step into that role because Batman was acting more and more violent after the death of Jason Todd. And so, obviously, look, comic book things happen. His mom died and his dad got paralyzed, and there's all kinds of things that happen there. But what made Tim Drake unique was that he was a hero who, unlike a Peter Parker or a Bruce Wayne or a Dick Grayson or the majority of characters, he wasn't motivated by a personal tragedy. He had decided to become a superhero on his own, and that, especially for the Gotham corner of things, made him a unique character. The other part that was really interesting with Tim was the fact that they emphasized, the detective skills of him. He was the guy who was very much like Bruce in that way. Whereas, Dick Grayson has the admirable heart and athleticism and things like that, but he's a different character than Bruce Wayne. Whereas Tim really had that same sort of mental detective sort of aspect to him that Bruce did. And that always made the partnership between the two seem really interesting. And they really emphasized the detective angle of Tim really well in his comic books. to the point that one of the best singular issues of comic books is in Detective Comics written by Tim Dini, where he kind of has this amazing comic where Tim, I think it's 826, where Tim survives this night where the Joker kidnaps him. And it's one of the better like singular one-off issues that exists, but it really highlighted how smart the character was, how resourceful the character was, and that even someone like the Joker throwing his worst at him, he was able to survive. And it's so interesting when you go back and you read the character in that period of time when that came out and contrast it to what we have now. And so I think you can look at some of the things that have just been subtly taken away from Tim. By far the most damaging things that I think happened to Tim Drake and where this has all gone wrong has been things that happened to him outside of a solo comic book. I think a lot of the trajectory of where his arc fell apart was identity crisis, where they decided to kill off his father. And that one of the unique things about Tim Drake was, unlike the other Robins, he was not really Bruce Wayne's son. Right? Bruce was more of a mentor to him and certainly a father figure, but more like a great coach or a great, uncle that you get along with or something like that, not his actual father. And when they decided to kill off Jack Drake in Identity Crisis, that decision kind of precipitated him all of a sudden becoming more like Batman's son and living in Wayne Manor. And I think that really took so much of the character away. In that, when you look early on, very early, when in Tim Drake's appearances, they have where he's in boarding school and his parents kind of, are gone a lot. And, one of the interesting things is that it's still kind of differentiated that Tim was his own person. He didn't live at Wayne Manor. And so while his dad was recovering, he was there. He lived separately from Wayne Manor. He was always a part of the Bat family, but he wasn't one of Bruce's kids. And I think that decision they made to have where basically he's adopted by Bruce, well, an admirable thing for Bruce to do. I think the thought of that really took so much away from the character, where he went from being his own character on his own, who was very different from the other Robins, to he's just another one of Batman's kids. And I thought that was an angle that just didn't work. It wasn't needed. I think you can look at where the next huge thing that happened to Tim was the implementation of Damian Wayne into the comic books, where basically at that point Tim Drake stopped being Robin. And it's an interesting thing in that, much like Dick Grayson grew out of the Robin role and became Nightwing, that should have been the point where Tim evolved out of the Robin role and became his own character. And there was an attempt at that with him becoming Red Robin. There was some interesting angles that were taken with that, and his series was really good. But it was very much like once DC had Damian Wayne come on board, they didn't know what to do with Tim anymore. And what's so stupid about that is that Tim was such a good character on his own that you could have just had him become a detective type character with Red Robin. That could have been a whole series. And for some reason, they acted like the addition of Damian meant that Tim needed to be downplayed or pushed aside. And really, what happened to the character after that has just become this confusing jumble of stupid stories. And that, Damian gets implemented, and then a couple years later, we get the new 52, where, they made the baffling decision to give him, in my opinion, one of the dumbest costumes ever, the new 52 Tim Drake suit was really bad. They redid his origin where he almost was the reason his family was driven away with some stupid activities that he did. They just rewrote him so poorly in the New 52, and then they reverted all that back with Rebirth. And I think James Tynion did some interesting work with the character. That was the last time Tim was good, but then after that, they lost the identity of who the character was. Constant reboots and trying to readdress his origin story, making him one of Batman's adopted kids, taking away his independence, having his parents get murdered, changing him from a character who was primarily motivated just by a desire to protect Gotham, and instead, mingling the tragic backstory piece of things. And I think overall, what you see happen is you see this character who used to be so well defined and so was so interesting become tetherless, become where they didn't know what to do with him, and they, throw him back into the Robin role again, and then Damian was in the role, so they didn't know what to do with him, and it just the weirdest thing that should have happened is much like Dick Grayson, there was a point that Tim Drake needed to evolve into his own character, and they were right on the precipice of doing that, and for some reason they just decided not to do so, and so he became this character who largely didn't have a place in the DC universe. He wasn't Bruce's Robin anymore. He was just another one of Gotham's characters in these comic books. And the weirdest angle with that is that he honestly, outside of Bruce, was the most successful character for a time. Nightwing obviously super successful, but when you look at it, the fact that his series ran for so long, he had so many issues, and he had been such a successful character, especially in a world where, when you create these legacy characters, oftentimes they don't connect with audiences. Right? I think Jason Todd's a great example of this, is that he was the second Robin, and while he has fans now as Red Hood, he was an unpopular character to the point that they voted to kill him off in the comics. And I know there was, supposedly one guy who called in all the time to swing that, but the fact that that even happened, the fact that it was even close where that could occur, kind of showed you the fan base wasn't a huge fan of Jason Todd. And the fact that you had Tim come in and that he was so well implemented and that he was a character that people loved and that spawned his own series, a couple mini series, and then an ongoing. He became a huge independent character outside of being just Batman's sidekick. And now they've gotten him to the point where, Tim Drake can't have his own comic book. I mean, they gave him a comic a couple years ago and it got canceled after 10 issues. And what was so interesting with him is that he was such a defined character. He had this great love interest in Stephanie Brown. It made him this complete character, and they just decided to strip all that away systemically from him, changing his origin at times, and then changing, his backstory, and then just turning him into another one of Batman's adopted kids. And I think all of that, when you subtly strip away who this character is over time, it leaves it right for what happened a couple years ago in the pages of Batman Urban Legends, which is where they decided that, essentially over the course of what would be one comic book, Tim Drake broke up off panel with his love interest of almost 30 years in the comics, if you go back. And they hadn't been together that whole time, but very much his established love interest, that off panel breakup. And then over the course of largely one comic, Tim, an old character from his solo series, and him all of a sudden are friends again, all of a sudden like each other, all of a sudden are dating, all of a sudden Tim has completely accepted this change, and he's a character who feels aimless and doesn't want to do anything except, be involved with this Bernard character. And what was so interesting is when they expanded this even further before it got a full comic book run, basically over the pages of an annual. If you look at all the page count, because it was told through an anthology comic book with backup stories, in the course of about 50 pages, he breaks up off panel, meets an old friend. The old friend is turned, into a character who's out of the closet. Tim all of a sudden wants to be with this character, even though that had never been established before about anything about Tim like that. Stephanie Brown immediately accepts it and thinks it's the coolest thing ever. And he's completely defined by that now. And the thing is, look, there's a lot of people who are upset simply because that change was made. And I'll be honest, that I don't think they could have ever done the change well. But the fact of the matter is that over the course of what would likely be page count wise an annual, you markedly changed the character. And again, if you look at just any other character, let's take Spider-Man, and let's say over the page 30 pages or 60 pages, if he had been with Mary Jane going into the comic book over the course of 60 pages, breaks up with Mary Jane off panel, starts dating, let's just take Felicia Hardy, starts dating Black Cat. Him and Black Cat are in love with each other. Everybody in Spider-Man's world is immediately happy about it, to the point that Mary Jane runs up and sees him with Felicia Hardy and goes, "Oh my gosh, you left me for this person. It's the greatest day ever." And that becomes the defining thing about Spider-Man going forward, to the point that, the only live action appearance of Tim Drake featured Bernard as the relationship that he's in. And again, could you have made that work over time? I don't know that I ever would have been happy with it, but you also look at the fact that they didn't even attempt it. It was just like, no, in 60 pages, this is this, and it will be his thing going forward. And every time he shows up in a comic book, this will be the defining thing that's there. Um, it's just so weird. It's a weird change in it. If you had enough confidence in the story and you wanted the story to work and you wanted the story to have investment, this could have been built up over time. With as many stupid characters as get comic books this day, where they'll push a Power Girl series for 20 something issues, or God knows how many other comic books we get. The fact that this didn't even take place over a 5-issue miniseries. I mean, and even that would have been rushed. But yeah, I have to imagine if you gave Tim Drake a comic book back before this change was done, You could have probably had 20 something issues where you could have shown the relationship with Stephanie fall apart and you could have seen Tim be a little bit aimless. And then this character from his past comes back and they build trust and relate. And you could have done that. And again, do I think that ever would have worked in a positive way? No, because it was always going to feel forced and it was always going to feel like, what the heck is this? But you could have attempted it and maybe you could have pulled that off. Instead, DC Comics was just like over the page of what would be an annual. This is done. Don't ask questions about it. Everybody in the Bat family, including the person that he left off panel, thinks it's the most amazing news ever. And that's it. To the point that when he got a solo series later, that was, a definitive thing. And it changed the character so much too. And that, if you look at Tim Drake, how he used to be drawn, this is from 30 years ago. He's a younger character, but he looks to be 16, 17, 18 years old. When they draw Tim now, 30 plus years later in the comics, oftentimes he looks as young or younger than Damian Wayne now. They draw him to look ridiculously young now. And I think it's just an interesting thing that they've done with this character where, because they took away systemically all of the things that made him independent and made him different than the other Robins, and then they themselves didn't even know why they were doing that or what to do with the character, this kind of became like hey, we might as well do this. And it's just sad that a character who has, and this is only a portion of him, but has this amount of story. I think they're probably, if they do this correctly, there'll be 3 or 4 of these compendiums of a character that was so well defined, had so many good stories, so many good comic books. That Detective Comics 826 that Paul Dini wrote, one of the coolest single issues of character, with him surviving the Joker. And that they did this to this character where he's without a tether now. He's without an identity. They've actually reverted him now to where he's Robin again, along with Damian Wayne, who's also Robin, to the point that it feels like Damian's a more developed character than the current version of Tim Drake. And I think he just kind of is a symbol for everything wrong with comic books now, and that it's not one singular change that they made, but he is a byproduct of every bad idea of comic books, the shock, death, kill kind of thing of deciding to kill off his father for shock value in an event comic book, reverting the character to, being just like the other characters, like the other Robins, where he has to become an adopted orphan, like the other Robins. Let's redo his origin and rewrite the character hastily in the New 52 reboot. The failure to commit to ideas like the Red Robin identity that he had, and the pretty awesome costume that he had at that point, and their lack of commitment to that. The destruction of a relationship off panel with no actual writing development or reason why. Just it was done because reasons and again, it kind of just seems like they couldn't actually tangibly write that well. So we just did it without, caring. And then the swift new identity kind of thing where, hey, this is the defining thing about this character, and if you question anything about it, you're actually the bad guy. And it just sucks to see a character like this that's been driven to this level to where I don't even get happy when he shows up in comic books anymore. When he was in Batman, they kind of announced he was going to be the main sort of sidekick character for Bruce Wayne in this new run of Batman. I was kind of hoping maybe we'd get something cool. In the first issue, the first issue that he shows up, he gets shot, and then immediately it's, oh, hey, Bernard, and that's the only thing we get is Bernard's apparently concerned for Tim Drake getting shot. And again, it's not that that's poor writing; it's just the fact that they've taken the character to the level that basically is the only reason he shows up anymore, to showcase that relationship with Bernard. It's just sad. It's just sad. And it's not even sad because that relationship exists. It's sad because there was such little care, such little forethought, such little explanation, such little investment of actually showing how we got from point A to point B. And more so, we're at point B, don't ask questions. And they've taken so much away from them. It just sucks. I'd be interested to see where folks' thoughts on this are down below. But sadly, Tim Drake has become the cautionary tale for everything wrong with modern comic books. And that's not off one change, that's off systemically chipping away what made this character great for years, to the point that he just doesn't have an identity anymore, and has ended up the place he's in. Let me know if you agree or disagree down below. As always, not pretending to be the expert. If you think that I missed something, or you think something about this story works well, or you think it's great, I'm happy to hear folks' opinions. As always, not going to get mad or anything like that. Everybody's fans here, and opinions are opinions. So it would be interesting to see yours. As always, folks, thank you for watching. God bless you. I hope you have a great rest of your day.